November 3rd, 1936, 9:23 p.m. Bumpy Johnson sat at a corner table inside Small's Paradise, watching 32 police officers walk through the door. Not to arrest him, to collect their money. Each officer had a white envelope waiting at the bar. Each envelope contained exactly $500 in cash. That's $16,000 total. In 1936 money, that's worth over $350,000 today. And this wasn't a one-time payment. This was the monthly collection. Every single month, 32 cops from 3 different precincts walked into Bumpy's club, picked up their envelopes, and walked out. No arrests, no raids, no harassment, complete immunity. But here's what makes this story legendary. Bumpy Johnson didn't start out bribing cops, he started out beating them. And what happened between those 2 points? What forced the NYPD to accept money from a black gangster in 1930s Harlem reveals more about power in New York than any history book will tell you. What nobody knew, what the newspapers never reported, is that Bumpy Johnson didn't bribe the NYPD because he was scared of them. He bribed them because he'd already proven they couldn't stop him. And once you understand how he got to that point, you'll understand why Bumpy Johnson became untouchable. If you're watching this channel, you already know Bumpy was different. But this story right here, this is the one that made him a legend. Hit that subscribe button because we're about to break down the most calculated power move in Harlem history. To understand what happened in November 1936, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in the early 1930s. This was the heart of the Great Depression. Harlem was suffering. Unemployment was over 50%. Families were getting evicted daily. People were hungry, desperate, and angry, and into that desperation came a lifeline, the numbers racket. For people who don't know, the numbers game was simple. You picked a 3-digit number between 0 and 999. You bet anywhere from a nickel to a dollar. If your number hit based on stock market figures or race results, you won 600 to 1. A dime bet could win you $60. A dollar could win you $600. Life-changing money for families living on $15 a week. The numbers racket was Harlem's economy. It employed thousands, runners who collected bets, bankers who held the money, controllers who organized the whole operation, and at the top, the people who protected it all. By 1933, Bumpy Johnson was one of those protectors. He worked for Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who ran the biggest numbers bank in Harlem. Bumpy's job was simple: keep the operation running, keep the police at bay, keep the Italian mob from muscling in. But there was a problem. The NYPD in the early 1930s didn't want bribes from black operators. They wanted arrests. The department was under pressure from City Hall to clean up Harlem. The newspapers were running stories about lawlessness in black neighborhoods. The mayor wanted results, and results meant bodies, specifically black bodies in jail cells. Between 1933 and 1935, the NYPD ran constant raids on Harlem numbers operations. They'd hit policy banks, arrest runners, confiscate money, and destroy records. They'd haul people into the precinct, rough them up, and release them without charges just to send a message. Goal wasn't to stop the numbers game. The goal was to make it so dangerous and expensive that black operators would quit and white criminals could take over. That's what the Italian mob was waiting for. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx-based mobster, had his eyes on Harlem's numbers racket. Millions of dollars a year flowing through black neighborhoods, and the Italians wanted every penny. The NYPD's raids weren't about justice. They were about softening up Harlem so Dutch Schultz could walk in and take over. Stephanie St. Clair saw it coming. Bumpy Johnson saw it coming. And in 1934, they decided to fight back, not with bribes, with war. Here's where Bumpy Johnson's reputation was forged. Between 1934 and 1936, Bumpy didn't just resist police raids. He turned them into disasters for the NYPD. The first major incident happened in February 1934. A squad of 15 officers raided one of Stephanie's policy banks on 139th Street. They expected to walk in, grab the records, arrest a few runners, and leave. What they didn't expect was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had stationed lookouts on every corner. The moment police cars turned onto the block, runners scattered. Money disappeared. Records were burned. By the time officers kicked in the door, the building was empty except for one man. Bumpy Johnson, sitting at a table reading a newspaper. The lead officer, Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, was furious. He knew this was a numbers bank. He knew Bumpy was involved, but he had no evidence. No money, no records, no witnesses. O'Malley got in Bumpy's face, started yelling, threatened to beat the truth out of him. Bumpy looked up from his newspaper and said 5 words that became legend in Harlem. "You'll need more than 15. O'Malley threw the first punch. Bumpy blocked it, stood up, and put O'Malley on his back with one hit. The other 14 officers rushed in. What happened next depends on who tells the story. What we know for certain is this. Bumpy walked out of that building with a split lip and bruised knuckles. 5 officers went to the hospital. O'Malley had a broken jaw, and not a single arrest was made. Because if the NYPD admitted that one black man had hospitalized 5 of their officers, the embarrassment would be worse than the injuries. The department buried the incident. O'Malley was quietly transferred, and Bumpy's reputation went through the roof. But Bumpy didn't stop there. Over the next year, he developed a system that made police raids nearly impossible. He built a network of lookouts that stretched for blocks around every operation. He installed early warning systems, runners with whistles who could alert an entire building in seconds. He trained his people to move like ghosts. Money went into false walls. Records went into stoves. Runners disappeared into basements that connected to adjacent buildings. By late 1935, the NYPD had raided Stephanie St. Clair's operations 47 times. They'd made 8 arrests. All 8 were released within hours because there was no evidence. The conviction rate was 0. The 32nd Precinct's captain, Vincent Mahoney, was under intense pressure. The commissioner wanted results. Dutch Schultz wanted access to Harlem. And this one black gangster was making the entire department look incompetent. So Mahoney escalated. He decided if he couldn't catch Bumpy in the act, he'd fabricate charges and beat a confession out of him. August 12, 1935, 11:15 p.m. 6 plainclothes detectives grabbed Bumpy Johnson as he walked out of the Cotton Club. They didn't arrest him legally. They threw a bag over his head, shoved him into an unmarked car, and drove him to an abandoned warehouse in the Bronx. This wasn't an arrest. It was a kidnapping. For 3 hours, they beat him. Fists, nightsticks, whatever they could use to break him down. They wanted a confession. They wanted him to name his associates. They wanted him to give up Stephanie St. Clair's operation. They wanted him to submit. Bumpy Johnson didn't say a word. At 2:30 a.m., they gave up. They dumped him on a Harlem street corner, bloody and barely conscious, assuming he'd learned his lesson. Assuming he'd be too scared to retaliate. They were wrong. Bumpy didn't go to a hospital. He went to Stephanie St. Clair's apartment. He told her what happened. And together they made a decision that changed everything. They were done playing defense. It was time to go on offense. Stephanie St. Clair had connections the NYPD never knew about. She had relationships with black newspapers, with civil rights lawyers, with politicians who owed her favors from years of supporting their campaigns. Within 48 hours, the Amsterdam News ran a front-page story. NYPD detectives kidnap and torture Harlem businessman. The article had details, names of the officers involved, description of the warehouse, medical documentation of Bumpy's injuries from a doctor who'd examined him. Stephanie had made sure everything was documented. Photographed, witnessed, the story exploded. This wasn't just another police brutality case. This was the NYPD kidnapping a civilian off the street and torturing him without due process. The NAACP got involved, City Hall got nervous, and the 6 detectives who'd beaten Bumpy were quietly suspended without pay. But Bumpy and Stephanie weren't done. They filed a lawsuit. Not a criminal complaint, a civil lawsuit seeking $50,000 in damages. The city's lawyers knew they'd lose. The evidence was too strong. The publicity was too damaging, so they made an offer. Dropped the lawsuit. The 6 detectives would be permanently transferred out of Harlem, and the 32nd Precinct would agree to a new arrangement. An arrangement where certain operations in Harlem would be left alone, in exchange for financial considerations. The NYPD was offering to accept bribes, not because they wanted to. Because Bumpy Johnson had beaten them so thoroughly that it was the only way to save face. Bumpy took the deal, but he did it his way. He didn't want a secret arrangement where cops could shake him down whenever they felt like it. He wanted a system, a structure, a business relationship where both sides knew exactly what was expected. So Bumpy created what became known as the envelope system. Here's how it worked. 32 officers across 3 Harlem precincts were put on the payroll. Patrol officers got $200 a month. Sergeants got $350. Detectives got $500. Captains got $1,000. In exchange, they looked the other way. No raids on Stephanie's policy banks, no harassment of runners, no interference with the numbers game. The payments happened on the first Tuesday of every month at Small's Paradise. Officers would come in during their off hours, dressed in civilian clothes, and pick up their envelopes from the bartender. No direct contact with Bumpy, no paper trail, no evidence. It was brilliant because it turned corruption into routine. The NYPD officers who took those envelopes convinced themselves they weren't criminals. They were just getting paid to not harass innocent businesses. They were just supplementing their income. They were just doing what everyone else was doing. Within 6 months, the raids stopped completely. Stephanie St. Clair's operation expanded. Other numbers operators saw what Bumpy had accomplished and started their own arrangements with police. By late 1936, Harlem's numbers racket was generating more money than ever, and a significant portion of it was flowing directly into NYPD pockets. But here's what makes Bumpy's move legendary. He didn't bribe the cops because he was weak. He bribed them because he'd already proven he was stronger. The NYPD couldn't arrest him legally. They couldn't beat him physically. They couldn't break his organization, so they took his money instead, and by taking that money, they admitted defeat. November 3rd, 1936, 9:23 p.m. Small's Paradise was packed. Jazz music filled the room. People danced, drank, celebrated another Tuesday night in Harlem. And one by one, 32 police officers walked in to collect their envelopes. Bumpy sat at his corner table, watching it all. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't nervous. He was conducting business in plain sight, paying off the people who were supposed to be arresting him. A young officer, maybe 25 years old, walked up to Bumpy's table, first time picking up an envelope. He was nervous, sweating, couldn't make eye contact. Bumpy looked at him and said something that the officer would repeat years later in his memoirs. "Don't feel bad about this. Your department put you in this position. I'm just giving you a choice they never gave me." The officer took his envelope and left. 31 more would follow. By midnight, every envelope was gone, $16,000 out of Bumpy's pocket, $16,000 that guaranteed freedom, protection, and respect. But the system didn't last forever. In 1938, Dutch Schultz was murdered by the mob. The pressure on Harlem eased. In 1939, a new mayor launched anti-corruption investigations. Several officers on Bumpy's payroll were caught and quietly forced into retirement. And by 1940, the envelope system was over. Not because it failed, because it had served its purpose. Bumpy Johnson had proven his point. He'd shown that in Harlem, real power didn't come from a badge. It came from intelligence, strategy, and the loyalty of a community that saw him as one of their own. Word of what Bumpy accomplished between 1934 and 1936 spread through the underworld like wildfire. Black gangsters from Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, they all sent people to Harlem to learn how Bumpy had done it. How one man had turned the NYPD from an enemy into a business partner. The Italian mob took notice too. They realized that Harlem wasn't going to be easy to take, that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another street thug. He was a strategist. And trying to muscle him out would cost more than it was worth. Stephanie St. Clair eventually stepped back from the numbers game, but Bumpy continued. He took the lessons from 1936 and built an organization that would control Harlem's underworld for 3 decades. He never forgot what those 2 years taught him. Power isn't about violence. It's about making your enemies realize that fighting you is more expensive than working with you. The NYPD learned that lesson the hard way. They came at Bumpy with raids, with arrests, with kidnapping and torture. And in the end, they put out their hands and took his money. Because that was easier than admitting they couldn't beat him. Here's what most people miss about Bumpy Johnson's bribery system. It wasn't corruption. It was reparations. The NYPD had spent decades extracting money from Harlem through illegal fines, planted evidence, and protection rackets for white criminals. Bumpy just systematized it. He turned their corruption into his advantage. He made them pay for the privilege of not getting embarrassed. And in doing that, he proved something that echoes through history. The system protects itself. When the NYPD couldn't beat Bumpy legally, they didn't reform. They didn't try harder. They just took the money and looked the other way. Because at the end of the day, the people enforcing the law care more about their own interests than the law itself. Bumpy Johnson understood that. And he used it to build an empire. He lived another 32 years after 1936. He survived wars with the Italian mob. He survived multiple arrests and prison sentences. He survived everything the system threw at him. And when he died in 1968, he died the same way he lived, on his own terms, free, unbowed, unbroken. The lesson from November 1936 never died. It became part of Harlem's DNA. A reminder that respect isn't given, it's taken. That power isn't about who has the biggest army. It's about who's willing to play the longest game. That the system isn't your friend, but it can be your business partner if you know how to negotiate. Listen, if this story opened your eyes, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we're dropping these deep dives into Bumpy Johnson's life every week. And trust me, each one is more incredible than the last. Drop a comment, was Bumpy justified in bribing the NYPD? Or should he have fought them a different way? Let me know what you think. And turn on those notifications because next time we're breaking down the moment Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office completely unarmed and walked out controlling half of Harlem. You cannot miss that story. Remember, in the streets of 1930s Harlem, justice wasn't something you received. It was something you created. and Bumpy Johnson created his own justice, one envelope at a time.